Hi, and welcome to the HappYness Helix Podcast. Today's guest is a special guest for me. He's the postman, as he refers to himself. And I credit him with being the person responsible for my journey as a coach. A friend, a colleague initially, and then a friend. Interesting person. Jaya Kumar is the name. Man of many parts. And education-wise, IIT Bombay, and then IIM Bangalore. And then worked with many well-known institutions like Wipro and then Oracle. And even before the word startup was probably spoken about, he was a startup entrepreneur in the Valley. Interesting anecdote that I heard from somebody else was that Jaya was the youngest member of the founding team of that startup, Neta. And when they started, he also was probably the person with the least amount of financial stake or the stock in the company. And through sheer dint of hard work and smart work, when the company was sold, he was on par with all the other founders. And then there are a couple of interesting anecdotes that I will share as we go in. And with that, welcome, Jaya. Happy to have you on the podcast. Absolute pleasure, privilege, and honor to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Cheenu. Thank you very much. And I am most honored to be here on the podcast with you.
So, the HappYness Helix is the name of the podcast. And I explained to you what the HappYness Helix is all about. And for the benefit of those who might not have watched earlier episodes, I'll give you a 45-second brief into what the HappYness Helix is. The premise is that the HappYness Helix is a spiral, and it has 6 landings that repeat again and again. So this moment is the first landing. And in this moment, if I take responsibility, 100%, for who, what, how, and where I am, chances are that I will get to the second landing, which is I will have a good attitude. If I have a good attitude and I'm taking responsibility, chances are that I'll get to the third landing, which is I will have a greater, larger circle of people who are willing to support me. And I can draw upon their expertise and their resources. And if I have that, chances are that I'll get to the fourth landing, which is I will set and achieve my objectives consistently and predictably. And if that happens, I'll get to the fifth landing, which is I will have greater self-confidence, belief, and all of that. And I will start focusing on not just me, but on other things, society, the world, etc. Which gets me to the sixth landing, which is I will take on larger than me and more important objectives. And if I have that kind of an objective, like our mutual friend Raj Sharma will say, I will tap dance into life. So, which brings me back to this moment, and that repeats again and again. The converse is the unhappiness slide, which is again starting from this moment. I hold everybody else responsible for however I am in my life, which is I don't take responsibility. Chances are, therefore, I will not have a great attitude, which is the second point on the slide, which leads me to the third point on the slide, which is I'm not liked, supported, and wanted by people, which leads me to the fourth point, which is I will have less than ideal achievement of my objectives, which naturally means that my confidence and self-belief will come down, which will take me to the sixth point, which is I will become less focused on other people. I'll be more in survival mode, and I will be looking at smaller, my own objectives. And I'll wake up feeling like something I want to scrape off my foot. So the unhappiness slide and the HappYness Helix. So I had when we spoke before our podcast, you had a very interesting take on this entire thing. And I'm going to start with a question. What does happiness mean to you? One. And then I'd like you to talk about what you think of this hypothesis What are your thoughts on it?
So, GS, when you actually enunciated this concept of the happiness helix, at the point at which you enunciated it, it echoed with a lot of experiences that I've had previously in life. That is, I found that at different stages of life, people say you come back to the starting point and begin again as a learner. However, you never come back to the same point because time has moved. So it's actually a spiral. Or if you keep it vertical, it's a helix. And each time, what is called a starting point may be a starting point in multiple dimensions. So it could be a starting point when you change your field. It could be a starting point when circumstances in your life undergo upheaval and you are at that point again. It could be a starting point when your life completely goes off in a direction that it was initially heading, goes off in a completely different direction. So each time you start afresh in some ways. And one of our common friends long ago used to be in HR, used to say, you may be even looking at the same scenery, but you have to look at it with new eyes.
Yeah.
Because it's starting again. So from a helix standpoint, I think it is reflected in everybody's lives in different ways. Some people recognize it, and perhaps most people just pass it by. However, I sometimes wonder about the question as to what is happiness. And again, when you talked about this concept the first time, it brought these thoughts up again in my life. So when we are children or when we are in college, we are given objectives. So you have to find a good job or you have to do something of meaning in life. Papa kehte hain, bada naam karega. If you remember that song from the movie back in the, I think in the late 80s, in fact, I think it was 87 or 88. You are told that you'll find happiness if you find a job or vocation and you get on with what everybody else is doing. And so they define happiness as a point to be reached. So I adopted, without thinking too much about it, it passes into your mind almost without evaluation. But as I went through life, I found that reaching destinations or reaching milestones was not happiness. You may have some goal, you will accomplish it, and then eventually you move on and the next thing turns up. So then the question arose in my mind, what is happiness? And to say it in a very sort of, in a capsule form, is that when you reach the stage where with a openness, you embrace what's coming to you, and you accept that the way you engage with what's coming to you is your own responsibility. So in some sense, it reflects what you say. You take responsibility for the way you engage with a situation, and you have the capacities, by and large, and you are willing to develop the capacities that are needed to engage with the situation that you face, and you are able to deal with it. That is, you feel that you are successful in navigating those situations. You emerge stronger from it. You are able to contribute to people around you. And that process has to be continuously recreated. So happiness, therefore, for me, has now become a process, not a state. So when you make a contribution to somebody, and that somebody could be yourself, you make a contribution to yourself in a way which allows you to be stronger. So there are two words that I've used, success and become stronger. So successfully navigate a situation. What does that success even mean? So again, in this case, I'll fall back to eventually, which I had to fall back to, was our Indic, from our Indic heritage, which says you do your work without regard to the results, or without regard to the consequences, or to the goal that you want. So So you have control on how you do things, how honestly or how authentically you do something, and you engage with the context. You may not necessarily have controls on the outcomes. You want to reach a particular outcome. So the outcome, you are not, therefore, your happiness in some sense is not necessarily attached to the outcome. It is attached to the process. And if you don't, if you meet the outcome, great. That's what we have like, that's the golden path. If you don't meet the outcome, then you figure out how do you proceed again, which our mutual friend Kichu used to sometimes call as upset setup. You might feel a little bit of, oh, I did not reach my goal, a momentary blip of disappointment, and then you're back. And you continue engaging wholeheartedly with the context. That process is happiness. There is another gentleman called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the book called Flow. And I came across that book in connection with one of my teachers. I had many teachers in life who've taught me so many things. Connection with this book was one of them. It talks about the flow state, where when you have the ability to do something well, and you have engaged with it, and you are in the process of doing what you can do well, you will not know that time has passed. You will just be working on it, and you will find inspiration coming in the context of what you are doing. And that state he calls the flow state. Having that flow state in life is what I would call happiness.
Beautiful. I think, it brings me to something that it dawned upon me, that if there is a reason that there is a shape and a form that exists, right? We're all from, science also agrees with this, that there is a shapeless, formless energy, which then takes on a shape and a form. And that shape and form becomes finite. And if it is a finite form and shape, then there is a certain reason, purpose for it to have taken that form. And one of the things that I tell people that I get to work with is that there are two ways in which you can achieve your purpose. One, you can actually know what your purpose is and then dedicate yourself towards it. Or like you say right now, the second, which is a simpler and easier way to do this, is to be purposeful in everything that we do. Right? So being purposeful, 100% committed. And if I were to take those two things that you mentioned, which is, one is, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey, the process itself. Being the best that I can be in the process, regardless of the outcome. Chances are that I will be in a place that, a state of flow.
Yes.
And therefore could be purposeful, therefore could be termed as happiness as well. Lovely. Interesting question for you. We've spoken about it, not on camera, but we've had enough and more interactions on this. One of the questions that I get asked, as when I say I'm a happiness coach, is that, do you teach people to be happy? The second question, which I find sometimes a little funny, is that, so you're always happy? Right? So I want to ask you this question. In your journey of life, how has it been? How have you navigated, the ups and the downs, as they would call it? Right? This morning I was listening to a podcast where people are saying that you need pain, you need fear, you need anxiety, you need the grief, you need the sorrow, because otherwise you will not be able to differentiate between one and the other. I think it's beyond that as well. My question to you is, in your life, I know that for a fact, personally I know that you've had a lot of ups and downs, and you've had a lot of challenges that you have faced in life. How have you handled those challenges? I'm not getting into specific challenges. I leave you to choose the challenges that you want to expand upon, starting from your startup, starting from the personal situation where, young children at home, all of that. So I'm just not going to elaborate more than that, but I'm going to leave it to you.
Great. So I might actually go back even further than that. So So there were, before I start off on my personal experience, two things I'll call out. One from a famous gentleman called Naval Ravikant. I know you're familiar with him, and most people are. So people tell you, hey, money does not give you happiness. But I have to sort of add a caveat that money does give you something, which allows you to, it creates a space for you to then figure out how to get to that flow state. If you can't pay your bills, then you're not going to be worrying about, I need to reach the flow state. You have to get to the basics first. So we have to be sure of our terms of reference, as they say, when we start talking about how to find happiness. So yes, you need them. They are like necessary conditions. So having said that, having got that out of the way, many people think that, to be happy is constantly to be thinking life is a big party. You are every day is a holiday, or you are always going on trips, and that's actually not happiness. In fact, it's actually your slide, your HappYness Helix slide, not the rising spiral. As you so rightly called out, you actually need both elements. And again, falling back on what my teachers taught me, opposites actually work together. And what people tend to refer to as happiness, perhaps because when we grow up, we watch movies and we go through various drama or narrations or stories, you tend to associate the word happiness with constantly laughter, gaiety, enjoyment, and words of this sort. But I think when people talk about happiness, and this is what, of course, drew me to your the way you phrase your this podcast as the HappYness Helix, is that happiness actually points to a state beyond that. And what our teachers said, that opposites actually work together. You need the difficult times, the challenges, the sorrows of life, along with the other experiences, together for you to be able to transcend them. This may sound a little abstract, but let me pick one example. So in school, from class 1 to 10, I did reasonably well, one of the academically, because my dad was a disciplinarian. I cannot claim that I was extraordinarily intellectually gifted. I was a regular kid with a very strong, the dad who was from the forces, so he was a disciplinarian, and used to do well in class. However, in my school, after the class 10 exam, they had a cutoff for science and commerce and so on. So the cutoff for science, I forget what the subjects were, the typical maths, physics and all that, was 280, and I was 279. And I was considered among the guys who were academically in the top few in the class. And I studied in Jesuit school. So my father, not my father, the father in the school, Father Fosho, he's now, of course, not around anymore. He said, hey, Jaya, our cutoff is 280, you're 279. I'm afraid you won't make it to the science. And I am the shock of my life, because I wasn't expecting something like that. Well, and all the friends that I had, the 5-6 of us who grew up together, had done exceedingly well and were into the science stream. So I sort of pleaded with the Padri and said that, hey, why can't I? So after all, only 1 mark. He says, I can't do it, because if I do it for you, then the 278 guy will turn up. And there was no guy at 278, but maybe there was somebody at 276. Says that it's a precedent, right? If I start relaxing the line at one point, where do you stop? I have to draw it somewhere. I, as in whoever the committee it was, and they had drawn it there. And so I came back that day home, really feeling very let down. So, and I didn't tell my dad. This was the situation. So, I just told Dad that, hey, I have to write, an exam to make sure that I get into the science stream. So, and then I used to read a lot on those days, and the newspaper in Calcutta was called The Statesman, and it used to have very good editorials and very good the op-eds on the center page. So I prepped for the exam, and then I went through the exam, and after the results came out, I had made the science, I made the cut. So the padri called me and said, Jaya, what did you actually do? I said, nothing. You had said that, hey, there were these few topics, which were the class 10 areas, and I prepped on that. But there was a section called general knowledge, which talked about India's space program at that time. And because I read all these newspapers, I knew a lot about this. And then when I wrote the answers for them, I think the people who checked the papers found my answers were so good that I maxed out the entrance exam, which had people from all over. It was like an open thing. People from other schools and colleges came in to apply for risk. So he said, how did you know about all this? And I didn't connect. And then I realized that I actually enjoyed reading them. And I was, because I enjoyed the process, I continued reading them. Even though I was preparing for this exam, I didn't prepare for it as if it were a school exam. I also continued reading what other stuff I was reading, and some topical questions were asked, and I responded to that. And I felt very good about it after getting back into class 11. And then I maxed out class 11 and 12 again. And then we went to the IITs. And these 5 of us who grew up together, we all went to different IITs. Most of us went to IIT Bombay, some of us to IIT Kanpur. One of us went to IIT Kharagpur and so on. So that was my first understanding that what nowadays is called anti-fragility. That if you face a setback and you emerge stronger from the setback, then you have grown in that context. And in this process of facing a setback, going through the emotional roller coaster, putting in what it takes to emerge stronger, is the process of being happy. And the reason why I say that is because of many of the people who made it, who sailed through that process from class 10 to class 11. There were only 5 of us who made it to the IITs that year. And all the 5 of us were together. The rest of the people who maxed out and who did brilliantly and went to the class 11 science stream, went to the regional engineering colleges, they did not crack the JEE. So, sometimes the old cliche that what does not kill you makes you stronger is actually true at many different levels that we don't recognize. So, your question on what is actually happiness? It is this. It is while going through it, you may not necessarily be elated. But if you feel a sense of determination, and if you are applying that determination to what you do, and you feel you can understand that you are growing in your knowledge, in your capacities and in your capabilities, that is the process or one of the elements of being happy. And when that meets a certain situation or a context, what people nominally call a test, it may be an exam, maybe a customer presentation, maybe a challenge of facing the market, and you then will go through facing setbacks and overcoming them, and you emerge stronger. So you will not, if you succeed in everything, then either you are lowballing yourself, or you're sandbagging, or you're not adequately, you can do a lot more and you're not adequately pushing yourself. So the process of going through this is what is happiness, which most people, because of our tendency, for example, if I talk about war, you and I have never really fought a war. And so we have seen war movies, and in our minds, the space of things that we don't know is filled up by those pictures of those movies. Similarly, when we grow up, that is happiness. Oh, eating ice cream is happiness. The ads, the movies, the comics, they tell you many things about what the word happiness means, and you end up thinking it's all laughter, gaiety, and life is a big party. It doesn't tell you that happiness is one step beyond, actually, where you may have laughter, happiness, gaiety, and all that. You will also have challenges, and you'll have the emotional ups and downs. But as you go through them, and your resolve, your determination, your ability to push yourself grows, the process of that growth is also one element of the happiness, not just this happiness, laughter, and gaiety. And so you have to transcend both. So the opposites actually work together to deliver you to a state when you recognize that I'm enjoying working in this situation where I'm challenged. And the people who come closest to that are sports people. And you see all our champions, PV Sindhu, some matches they will lose. and then next they come back to win a tournament. Or if you look at our cricketers, famous cricketers, or the javelin thrower, who is now really maxing out the number of medals that he's winning. Of course, he won a silver this time. Again, a little setback, and then maybe he bounces back. So they face this process of growing stronger from a little setback, and both the process of growing stronger as well as successfully integrating to a newer level of capability, that process is, all of that is the first state. And all of being in that state is happiness, not life is a big party.
No, and coming back to when I was listening to you, a couple of multiple things that I picked up. One small anecdote. You were talking about, I used to read a lot, right? Everybody who's met me, they are in awe of, how much I read, etc., etc. And to many of them, I say that my interest in reading was rekindled by you. Because I remember coming to your home on Banarghatta Road once, and I could only see books all over the place. Books on the table, on the sofa, everywhere, books. And an interesting anecdote for people watching, 1,400 books on mathematics alone, you donated to a university, right?
Yes.
When was this?
This was just a couple of years back, in 2 years after COVID started.
2 years after COVID started, and you gave away 1,400 books on mathematics to a university, right? My question is, why did you need 1,400 books on mathematics?
So, great question, Cheenu. One of the things I developed early on, and that all credit to my mother. I still remember the day when I was in class 4 or 3. My mom started reading the Chanda Mama. You remember the famous Chanda Mama? We didn't use it. We read, when we are growing up, we read some books. People will tell you how to read alphabet books, or in your class they will teach you some books to read. But we are not readers. The person who instilled that was my mother. For both me and my brother, she would read the Chanda Mama books in English. And so after some time she said, read it for yourself. Why do you want me to read it to you? And I started reading, and that's how it started. The desire to read. And then it just took off from there. I used to read Perry Mason in class, I think I was in class 6 or 7. And then Westerns like Max Brand, Louis L'Amour. Most people will not even know those writers today.
Oliver Strange,
Sudden. Both Frederick Christian, yes. Oliver Strange. All of them is class 6, class 7, gone through the entire library in my school. Because we used to work with the padris to help manage libraries. We would take books home, and then I started reading Hindi. So I had this passion for getting books and reading them, and reading like crazy, and reading fiction for a long time. Then when I went to college, I started reading non-fiction stuff, and that would take books on science, the Dancing Woolly Masters, if you've heard of some of them, authors of that kind. And then the fact is that I used to be really interested in math. And then when my kids came along, I was very keen that they need to be good at math. And it's very strange. Both my kids are reasonably good at math. Though my daughter is not a science student, is not a STEM student. She's very good at the math, strangely, because I think of the context. So I got a lot of math books in the process. And I used to like to read math topics. And my mother used to sometimes laugh at me that, the Vedic math book, the famous thing is tells you how to do arithmetic really fast. And I used to do a lot of that stuff many decades ago. And she used to laugh that other people watch TV and go to the movies. You sit and do this Vedic math to practice arithmetic to what end? And I used to tell her, I just like doing it. The happiness that you are able, there's a capacity that you can get, and to do a 4-digit multiplication in your head. Of course, now I haven't done it for a while, so I would probably be rusty if you asked me to do such stuff. But I could do those at that time in my head, 4 digit by 4 digits multiplication. So, and because of again, an index system of arithmetic. They call it Vedic maths, but there's nothing Vedic about it. As one of another teachers I have, Professor C.K. Raju, says very strongly. So one of the reasons I got these books was in pursuit of topics to understand clarity of concepts. I would get the books and I would read them. And I did not want to hear things secondhand. I would like to read them and then build, you might call it a mental model or knowledge. Now Elon Musk has made it very famous. How you start from first principles and build a structure of knowledge. And as you learn a new area, and Elon Musk has moved from, he was in PayPal, and from there he moved to building cars, and now he's moved to space and rocketry. And so he's building, how does he cover such a vast body of knowledge? He's talked about it. That same structure of how do you cover different areas and integrate them in your mental framework was something that maybe it's perhaps not as efficient as Elon Musk says or as good as it is, but it was something that you sort of built on your own as well. And because of that, I ended up with a lot of books. And then at a point in time, I wanted my kids to attempt being on the Math Olympiad team. However, that was a struggle where I did not succeed. Because in those times, you had to talk to some professors in very famous colleges in the city and ask them to get your kids to be into the process which put them in line for bidding for the position in the team. And I'm choosing my words very carefully when I say that. Strangely, those professors showed no interest despite continuous follow-up of getting those kids in. It's far easier today. This was, I'm talking back in the early 2000s. So that's how I came to have the books. But the driver was that very clearly in my mind, I would like to read something and understand it myself. And then when I have doubts, I would like to engage with people who know the topics and understand their perspective and thereby enrich what I know. And that's how I came to have. And my journey in life ended up having me accumulate or get books where if I had to tell my kids any particular topic, I wanted to be clear that I knew it very well. Otherwise, I'd rather take them to somebody who knew it better than I did and have them explain it to him than teach somebody something which is perhaps not complete. So that is the reason that I ended up having so many books. And it's interesting, you picked on the fact that I said I used to read a lot. I had teachers who told me that if you do something which you cannot help doing, then that is just being a slave to that capacity or to that ability. You must be able to turn it on or off. And so a few years back, very recently, maybe 5-6 years back, I stopped reading all fiction books. And now I read only non-fictions. Very rarely, unless there is an extremely important reason to read fiction. And it took a little effort because my tendency is to just take a book. Today, I'm able to get all the books by an author if somebody talks to me about author. Get all of it and just run through it from start to finish. But now I have stopped doing that. I have, especially for fiction. For non-fiction, I still sometimes am indulgent with myself. I would get the books and go through it. But I would like to follow or learn the ability to be able to turn a capability on or off. So rather than being a slave to that capability, I would rather like to, I would not like to use the word master, but be in control of my own self.
Very interesting because the last, I think, 18 years, the only fiction that I've read is the Shiva trilogy. And that was because somebody gifted me those books. A good friend of mine gifted me the three Immortals of Meluha and 3 books. Interesting. And that's the only fiction I've read in the last 2006 to 18 years now. Right? And recently you gifted me some exceptionally interesting books as well. And I was surprised at the kind of books that you had, right? Given my journey the last 15 years, I would have thought that would be normal for me to have those books. Facilitation, coaching, all of those things. And you gifted me those books, and absolutely amazing books. So it's not just that you're, like you said, it's not just that you're reading about mathematics or whatever. I think it's a wide range of topics that you have learned from. I'm going to actually take a small thing. I remember your son Shreyas. I think when he was 13 or 14 when I met him then. And we were talking about reading. And I actually told Shreyas that, my interest in reading has been rekindled thanks to your father. And he looked at me and he said, of course, uncle, everybody must read. So I was curious that a 13-year-old, 14-year-old was saying something as profound as this. So I asked him, I said, so Shreyas, why do you think that we must read? His answer, he might have forgotten. I've said it to him twice and he says, did I say that? Very profound answer. Of course, uncle, everybody must read. How else will we know how great minds think? Right?
Yep.
I think that was amazing. And I'm talking about this for a reason, Jaya. My interest in reading was thanks to my father. He would read the entire range of topics. Right? We had, growing up, had the entire Encyclopedia Britannica at home, had the entire Time Life Fortune series at home. He had a library, a legal law library, which many of the legal luminaries, they came and said, this is the most extensive legal library that we've ever seen. And he wasn't a lawyer, he was a chartered accountant by profession, but he knew more law than most lawyers did. Right? And he would read fiction, a lot of fiction. He would read on Indian, all our scriptures and so on and so forth. So I think my leaning towards reading, and now it has expanded to, because we have so many sources of information. Yesterday, my daughter was asking me, I said, what are you watching? And I was watching something about, the universe. And the next thing I was watching was about what is going on at the level of the cell. And the third thing I was watching about was what happens in the brain. And the fourth one was a discourse from our Upanishads. And then the fifth one I was watching was something about a pastor who was giving a discourse on what is spoken about in the Bible. And I realized that in all of the five, I could find some invisible dots that I could connect, which I think talks to what you mentioned about, first principles and being able to collate all of the information and finding the pattern in them, so to say. Right? So I think what you're saying is very, very interesting. And I actually wanted to ask you one more question. I'm certain, because I've heard this from people who used to work with you in your other stints, that your favorite gift was giving people books. Is that right?
That's absolutely right.
Okay. And how do you choose what book to give to whom?
So, a lot of it is very context dependent. So, for example, I used to work for a company called Ariba, which was in the procurement space. And when I joined the company, I found it was a very small number of people. Eventually, it grew to a really large size relative to the entire company's size. But I found that people did not really understand the procurement space. They were programmers. There are some people who were customer support, there were consultants, and they understood what they were doing, but they did not understand procurement. So then I found out and got and acquired a lot of books on the procurement space, which are very difficult to get in India at that time. Got them from the US and got multiple copies of the same books. And I would distribute them because I wanted what in today is very fashionably called democratizing something. That is, democratize knowledge. And you made sure that everybody understood the space. You distributed the books. This is a context-driven example. The other kind of thing is what sometimes people call inspiration. You feel that, hey, this book might be really, and this is something I know you understand really well, might be useful for this individual at that time. You may not have any rational reason why. And many times I know for a fact this happens in multiple contexts. And that's why I keep saying I'm the postman. Something is given to you in trust. You may think you're the owner, and it can be money also. But something will come around for which the money or the book or the item exactly matches what that individual requires or thinks to require or needs. And you realize that you are just the person who made the two connect. And so a book turns up and you go through the book and you maybe learn something. And then if you are curious, you might wonder, hey, how come this book crossed my path? Or you might not. Typically, if you're a voracious reader, you might not wonder. Then a few days later, somebody will turn up who will start talking about this and saying that I'm struggling to understand this. And then you realize, oh, you are a postman actually. That book was meant for this person. It just crossed your path and you hand over the book to that person. Sometimes an amount of money has come out of the blue. Maybe somebody returned or thought they were returning some money, or some dividend comes unexpectedly. It lies at home. And then somebody turns up who needs that money. And then you realize, oh, and strangely the amounts are the same. And this has happened many times. You realize that many times you are just a custodian. Things come. It's not always true. But there are times when things turn up in your life, and that's why you are a postman. You just make the connection, and that's the only role you have to play, and you step back. And then things will happen as they will for each of the people or context in them. So that's another way in which I've sort of shared books. The third is where I actually have a definitive role to play. For example, with my children, I have a role to play as a parent. With some people who feel that, hey, they would like some mentoring help from me. So then after I figured out where they are looking for mentoring, things will suggest themselves, or I will know already perhaps some things in the field, and then I share some books with. So that is the way I used to give people books. There is only one time I have picked a book completely out of context and shared it with everybody in the company. And again, it was to learn something for myself as well as to see. And this is a book called Being Different by Rajiv Malhotra. And I felt that was the first book that I came across which met the West on Indic terms, in the area of knowledge, which Western culture and Western civilization presents, and what Indic culture presents, and the distortions of the West has introduced in its understanding of Indic culture. And therefore, I bought 60 copies of the book and distributed it to every manager in my office. And just to see whether it would people would have interest. And this was almost, you could say, an experiment that I conducted. Out of the 60, only 2 came back. A few read the books, a few found it really hard going, but they have all kept it. And interestingly, a decade and a half later, people now call up and say, hey Jaya, you gave me this book. I just read it only a few years ago and I was shocked at what was there. And the understanding of, Rajiv ji had written that 2 decades ago. I mean, even before the book came out, he had written it and had debated the book with Francis Clooney, I think, I think he's a Jesuit priest from Harvard. And that debate is there on YouTube. So sometimes it takes decades for ideas to sink in. And this was my small experiment in learning that people who are completely disconnected from that context, when a context is presented to them or when ideas are handed to them, how long does it actually take to surface? You'll be surprised. The answer is 10 years. And it's not as if you can tell people something and get them to absorb it or understand it or even look at it. It takes some time, but it's a time that you have to give. And strangely, independently corroborated to me by giants in this field like Professor Raju and others, that typically ideas in mathematics or ideas in science or new ways of looking at things takes approximately 10 years before it becomes reasonably familiar in the environment.
I have a follow-up question. I gift books to people. One of the areas that I've been I'm actually using the word trying intentionally, is to get people to read. Right? What thoughts do you have on that? How have you? I know that I can adopt the same thing, postman. My job is to give you the book, and what I say is that my version of you can take a horse to water, you can't make it drink. My version of that is some horses won't drink even when they are drowning. Right?
Yeah.
How do you inspire somebody to read? Can you? Is it useful? Or should you just look at it like our scriptures say, don't be attached to the results. Your job is postman, give the book, be done with it.
I think it depends on your role in that context.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I had no role in this particular experiment that I carried out with the distributing the 60 books to the different managers. But sometimes, and if that is something that interests you, you might be a student of human nature, of people. And you find questions in people's minds. And you can sense it, or when you talk to them, so when you see those questions, or there is an answer to it, so sometimes I engage them in that conversation, and they will ask, so where did you know this from? And you don't immediately respond to it, and you have a few more discussions. And then they say, hey, I'm sure you must have some source. And so you stimulate the curiosity for a particular context. And then you hand them, hey, I learned it from this. And it's not, I didn't come up with it, otherwise I would be born with all gyan the moment I was born in the hospital. So you should also read this. And maybe you will know more and I might learn from you. And that's one of the things that I have really benefited from GS. And you are a prime example of that. I found that when you do things like these, it always comes back to you. So even though you say that some of the inflection points in your life, I had a role to play, its converse is also equally true. But it is not a transaction. So you do something and something happens. They happen differently and in different ways. And only if you're alert to the pattern do you recognize that you could do many things today, and many of those things come back to you in this life. It's not, you don't need a prarabdha karma and sanchita karma and all those various karma theories of Hindu metaphysics. People whom you have interacted with in a positive way, many times the positiveness comes flowing back into your life. And definitely I can say this confidently after 4 decades of having lived through staggering ups and downs, that this is most certainly unequivocally true in life. However, you have to be alert to it. Most people don't connect how these things work.
I took something away very interesting from this. Also the title of one of the books that you gifted me. I realized that in some sense I'd asked you a how question. Right? And Peter Bloch's book, The Answer to How is Yes, came to mind. ever since you've given me that book, the first introduction to that book has been heard by a few hundred people whom I've interacted with. The answer to how is yes. I think very interesting that you mentioned that you pique the curiosity in the person. To get people to be interested, just lay out like a trap some information from the book or whatever it is, pique their curiosity, and then make them come in terms of where did you get this information from is a better way of getting people to get to read the book itself. Or just this morning, I shared a podcast, and some feedback that I normally get from people is when I share podcasts that are 2-3 hours long. 3 hours? How do you expect me to, listen to this? And in my mind, initially I used to be a little irritated. Now I find it funny because the podcast that I share with people, I've listened to at least 2 times before I think it's worthy of being shared with somebody else, right? So I think because one of the things that I've noticed, Jaya, is that you actually inspire people to read, to learn and all of that. So that has been my bugbear, so to say. How do I inspire people? So one of the pieces of feedback that I've obtained from people who have been watching this podcast is that we love what you're talking about. We love what the guests are sharing. But Cheenu, 2.5 hours, 3 hours, make it into smaller bits, no? We want to hear you. And, this came from obviously a person in Bangalore who said that, most people in Bangalore say, our driving time is about 45 minutes, which might be just about 2 kilometers, but that's besides the point. So they said that, you should probably look at making these episodes, even if you're doing a longer podcast, make it into parts. So I'm going to start that with you, Jaya. Okay. So what we're going to be doing now is to sort of take a break, and then we get into segment 2. And in segment 2, what I'd like to speak to you about, and what I'd like to hear, and for the viewers and the listeners to learn from, is that you were an entrepreneur in the late 90s, and you were a technology entrepreneur, right? Data mining and data analytics and all of that. I would say that it was much tougher to be an entrepreneur then than it is to be an entrepreneur today. And I get to work with quite a few entrepreneurs, and I find that there are so many lessons that people can learn from people who've been there, like you, who've been there before. So we're going to take a break now, and I'd like to pin you down on some of these things where if you can get into specifics in terms of, what are the challenges that you faced and how did you manage, right? Especially things like young children at home, 2 people equally accomplished on 2 different career paths, so to say, and how did you blend all of that together? And intentionally using the word, how do you marry it together, right? I'll be talking about that if that's okay by you, and sure. We'll take a break now. With that, please stay tuned for part 2 and maybe part 3 of the conversation, the dialogue that I'm having with Mr. Jaya Kumar. Thank you.